joining us for tonight's event, the fascinating stories behind our favorite Christmas traditions. Easy for me to say. So author Brian Earl is here tonight to deliver a presentation based on his new book, Christmas Past, the fascinating stories behind our favorite holidays traditions. Brian is a designer, writer, and podcaster in Silicon Valley. He's also one of those people who puts up the Christmas tree on Halloween and takes it down on Valentine's Day. His Christmas Past podcast debuted in 2016 to immediate acclaim with a storytelling and a production style meant to mimic public radio news pieces. His podcast features expert guests and listener-submitted Christmas memories, all in bite-sized 10 to 15-minute episodes. Brian has either been interviewed or the podcast has received mention in Vanity Fair, Modern Woman, USA Today, the Financial Times, Best Life, Bustle, Huffington Post, Pop Sugar, and many other local and national media outlets. So all 150 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Brian for joining us here tonight. And Brian, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. It was great hearing all the names of those Stoughton towns, or Massachusetts towns. I don't know if we mentioned that I'm from Stoughton, Massachusetts originally, even though I'm coming to you today from San Jose in the Bay Area in California. I grew up in Stoughton, lived in Jamaica Plain and Easton for a long time. I'm coming back. I'll be back next week if the weather cooperates. I've been following those same reports you all have of the storm. Looks like it'll be mostly rain on the 23rd, so I'm feeling okay about that. But also, we're 6 days until Christmas. And at this point in the season, either you've gotten everything or most of the work done, most of your shopping and wrapping and baking, and so you're using this free time to hang out here with me. And so if that's the case, I appreciate it. Or this is crunch time for you, in which case I still appreciate that you're, I don't know, procrastinating or something like that to spend a little time with me. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the podcast in general, some of the traditions that I've covered on it, and how that is translated into the book. They're kind of part of the same family, and all really related to this kind of work that I've been doing as something of a second career since 2016. And it all started with, well, a couple of things, but number one is just this central belief that Christmas is not only the most wonderful time of the year, although I think we can all agree it's definitely that, but it's more than that. It's also the most fascinating if you're willing to just kind of step outside of things for a moment and take a look at it with, I don't know, a lens through which you've maybe never looked at it before. We can look at it in a couple different ways. Number one is at the sort of high level, the macro level, looking at Christmas as this cultural phenomenon where there's so much about the world that we change the way that it looks. We change the way that the world sounds and smells. And we even change just a lot about ourselves. Our attitudes. We become a lot more generous. We become more charitable this time of year. We change a lot of our schedules and our living habits. We change the foods that we eat, the clothes that we wear, including those ugly sweaters. And as an observer of those trends, it's the kind of thing that I've covered. There's a chapter in the book that mentions ugly sweaters, even though I'm not a huge fan of those, to be honest. So I know we changed the way that we dress around Christmas. I'm looking forward to the decline of the ugly Christmas sweater. And we even changed the way that we talk. When else do you use the word merry, for example? Unless you're describing a merry-go-round or saying the word, the more the merrier. That's a word that exists. We keep that word in our vocabularies just so that we can pull it out for about 6 weeks out of the year, like we do with all of our other Christmas decorations, to wish one another the greetings of the season. And we even use words that we hardly ever use at all, like things like twas or humbug or tis, right? You know, those are things that become part of our speech, whether ironically or unironically, for about a month out of the year, and then they go away again. Now that at the macro level is really interesting, I think, as just a thing that humans do. And generally what I'm describing is a notion of festivity, because this is something that we do for any other kind of special occasion as well. Birthdays, weddings, Easter, Mother's Day. One of the things that makes festivity what it is that we change our environment. We put up decorations, we change the way that the world looks, we change the clothes that we wear, we practice certain traditions and have certain sayings or gift giving traditions that we practice. But nowhere do we see this as dramatically and as for as prolonged a period as we do during the Christmas season. And when I say the Christmas season, that's a moving target. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on. There's this battle that comes every year. Well, do we start celebrating before Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving? And the truth of the matter is that Thanksgiving being the dividing line is really new. It's newer than you probably realize, and it's totally contrived. A group of people basically decided that we start celebrating Christmas, pardon me, right after Thanksgiving about 85 years ago, or maybe a little bit more than that. We'll talk more about that later on. But then you can also look at the micro level, right? So there's the macro level of just, festivity and this thing that, it's like this human trait of festivity and how Christmas is just maybe the most dramatic example of it. But then there's at the individual level of all of the different Christmas traditions that we practice. And for every single one of them, there's a story. There's a reason we cut down a tree and put it in our living rooms. There's a reason we put wreaths on our windows. There's a reason that we say Merry Christmas when we could just as easily say Happy Christmas. There's a reason that we drink eggnog at Christmas time and not at any other time, and ditto for a lot of foods. And we'll get into some of those later on. It's really interesting that foods like gingerbread, fruitcake, a steamed Christmas pudding, these are things that are exclusively associated with Christmas, even though for most of their existence, they were just foods that you would have either in the winter or at some kind of celebration. And then eventually they just kind of got weeded out of everything except for Christmas. George Washington served eggnog at Mount Vernon pretty much all year round, anyone who would come. Martha Washington famously had an eggnog recipe. Only in fairly recent times has eggnog disappeared outside of the Christmas season. There's another interesting thing when we can go one level down, right? So from the macro to the level of individual Christmas traditions that we celebrate to traditions that we celebrate but don't celebrate. And I'll tell you what I mean. If you open up a Christmas songbook, you'll almost certainly find the Boar's Head Carol, even though I don't know anyone who eats a boar's head for Christmas. That was once common if you were wealthy. Things like hot buttered rum, things like wassail. These are, or sugar plums, right? When we say visions of sugar plums danced in their heads, at the time that poem was written in the early 1820s, that was a common word. People would understand what that means. And again, it's sort of like that fossilized language that we pull out like merry or humbug once a year. It's part of the season, but it almost like haunts the season like a ghost because we mention it and it's part of things, but it's not. It's only part of the season because it exists in songs and poems. And even so, in England, for example, we get most of our Christmas traditions from Victorian England. A lot of those traditions never quite carried over. It's not that you don't see Americans making mince pies. I make mince pies. My 2-year-old son is growing up with them. He loves them. But the truth is the average American doesn't do a lot of minced meat around Christmas. And the same is true for the steamed traditional Christmas pudding. However, when you listen to the song, We Wish You a Merry Christmas, that first verse is, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And then the next 3 verses are all about figgy pudding. We all love a figgy pudding, bring us a figgy pudding. We won't go until we get one, even though most Americans wouldn't know one if they saw one. And if they had one, they probably wouldn't like it. Most Americans who I know who try to make or consume a figgy pudding, they don't get it. They say, I'd rather something else. So these are the kinds of things that I was thinking of when I decided to start Christmas Past. If you celebrate Christmas, this will sound like a really obvious thing to say, but if you celebrate Christmas, the odds are you always have. You've never known a life without Christmas. And so, especially as you get older, where Christmas starts to feel maybe a little bit repetitive, I still enjoy the Christmas season, but the truth is, this is going to be my 40-somethingth, Christmas season. And putting up the tree this year, it seemed like it was just a few months ago that I had put it away. And so when we take a step back and really look at these things, think of creating a lens through which we can look at Christmas as something that's fascinating and strange and just worthy of digging down deeper, for my money, it adds an extra layer to your Christmas spirit or a new dimension to your appreciation for it. And so it was back in 2015 when I was listening to a lot of podcasts like Planet Money and Radio Lab and ones that NPR puts out, the BBC. Really liked, radio style storytelling. I listened to a lot of old time radio. And I said, I wonder if that exists, but for Christmas. Is there such things like Freakonomics, but for Christmas? Now, back in 2015, in the world of podcasts, there were maybe like a dozen Christmas podcasts altogether. There wasn't a lot to choose from at all. And most of it was nothing at all like what I was looking for. There was a couple of churches that would put out their Christmas sermons in podcast form. There was some DJs who would put out playlists of like Celtic Christmas music or something like that. And then a couple, where it's just 3 people that would review all of the Hallmark Channel Christmas movies, but nothing at all. Long story short, nothing at all like what I was looking for. And I said to myself, I can't be the only one who would be interested in something like this, something that is a combination of just a warm-hearted celebration, but also a nerdy deep dive that uses a lot of storytelling to dig into these things that we do every year without really thinking about it. Again, we chop down a tree and put it in our living room. It feels normal, but it's weird, right? There's got to be a weird, interesting story behind that. And all of the things that we do for Christmas, even things that seem mundane, even things that seem like there might not be anything interesting underneath it, like, for example, wrapping gifts. You'd better believe that there's an interesting story behind that. We use enough wrapping paper. One company alone, American Greeting, produces enough wrapping paper every year to circle the planet 12 times. And all of that is fairly new. The notion of wrapping gifts for Christmas, believe it or not, is kind of like a late 19th, early 20th century thing. So I said, okay, well, if this podcast doesn't exist and I have a pretty good idea that other people would like it and no one else seems to be volunteering, I'm going to give this a try. Now, the problem with that for me was that I have no business doing anything like that. Again, if I was trying to mimic NPR, well, I'm not a radio producer. I'm nothing like that. And if I wanted to present the backstories to Christmas traditions and, talk about Christmas history, well, I had another problem because I'm not an academic. I'm not a historian or a biographer or a linguist or anything like that. And those are the kinds of people that I've turned to produce this podcast. And so some of the most interesting conversations I've had in my adult life have been talking to the, again, like museum curators, historians, botanists, linguists, the CEO of a candy cane factory, someone who runs a Santa Claus school, to really try to get what's in their heads, to take their information. And then what I'm bringing to the table is the storytelling, is packaging all of that up into a specific and stylized listening experience that aims to put a story to the things that we do every year. And if you've listened to an episode before, I also include Christmas memories from listeners, and package all that up into about a 10 to 15 minute episode. So the goal is you're going to learn something you didn't know before. You're going to feel a little bit of nostalgia. You're going to get your Christmas warm and fuzzies in about the time it takes you to wrap a gift, or about the time it takes you to make a trip to the local store. So I have no idea of the people who are here, how many people have ever heard of me before, or have any idea what I do. So I figured I'm going to play you a really short snippet of an episode from 2016, just to kind of give you a flavor for what I do. And then we're going to dig into some specific Christmas traditions. And I hope this works. We tested this before. You should be able to hear my audio. And I'm going to press play. Now, I'm not going to play a full 11 minutes. I'll just play a couple minutes of the intro to this one episode. I've always loved those stories about famous products that were invented by accident. Maybe you've heard the one about the naval engineer who was working with tension springs, and when he dropped one on the floor, he noticed that it almost looked like it was crawling. And the next thing you know, the Slinky is one of the top-selling toys on the market. Or how about the company that was trying to make a super strong adhesive, but when they failed, they sold the result anyway, as Post-it notes? Well, here's one that maybe you haven't heard. It's about 2 brothers who ran a stationery store in Kansas City. The year was 1917, and like most retailers at the time, they offered customers plain tissue paper to use as wrapping paper. Only back then, it was referred to as gift dressings.
which is kind of awesome and really needs to make a comeback. But one day, during the Christmas season, they ran out of gift dressings, so Raleigh, one of the brothers, went back to the warehouse to look for something, anything they could use instead. He found a stack of fancy, brightly colored paper sheets. They planned on using them as the inner linings of their fancy envelopes. So he brought some of it back to the store, priced the sheets at 10 cents a pop, and the stuff just flew off the shelves. They couldn't keep up with demand. And just like that, a whole new industry was born. The wrapping paper we know and love today, with its bright colors and printed patterns, can trace its beginnings back to that one day, that one decision made in 1917 by a man named Raleigh Hall, who along with his brother J.C. ran a company that's still around today. Maybe you've heard of it. Hallmark. But what's maybe even more interesting is the fact that when all of this happened, the idea of wrapping gifts for Christmas was only about 50 years old. It seems unimaginable that there was ever a time when gifts wouldn't be wrapped. Think of the anticipation created by the concealment of gift wrap, or the beauty of a decoratively wrapped gift, the excitement of unwrapping to reveal the surprise of what's inside. All of that is relatively new. And there's an interesting story behind it, one that has to do with the influence of media, the rise of industrialization, and the birth of consumer culture. I'm Brian Earl. This is Christmas Past.
So that's what I do. I take a story, I take a Christmas tradition, I find the most qualified person I can to help me understand it more, and then I really try to apply a bunch of storytelling to find the interesting pieces and then reveal them using all kinds of little, surprise and delight. And I think that intro is a pretty good example of, I'm telling you the story, but then I'm saving it for a surprise that, what I've been talking about the whole time is Hallmark. Oh, and now here's another surprise. Guess what? We didn't always wrap our gifts. And the reason that we do it now is really a bunch of things that are coming together at just the right time. And we see this again and again and again with many of the modern traditions that we celebrate. The ones that really came into being around the mid-19th century happened at a time when the print media was exploding, which was just created new avenues for influence and for marketers to sell their wares. We were becoming a much more industrial society. Globally, that was true, but in America especially. Pre-Civil War, 1 out of every 3 Americans was a farmer. And then after that, we all became, doing more like office jobs or industrial kinds of jobs in factories. There were major advances in transportation. The 19th century saw widespread rail travel, which meant that we could ship goods long distances, and store-bought items became a lot more part of our daily life. There was just a changing economy, a rising middle class, and there are all kinds of other little things that you probably don't appreciate, or that you realize they're part of the Christmas season, but you kind of take it for granted. And the big one was postal reform. In the late 19th and early 20th century, when parcel post came along and you could send stuff in the mail instead of just letters, that changed Christmas forever. Christmas depends on a functioning postal service. So I take a look at a lot of these kinds of factors, and I love painting the picture about how every tradition that you celebrate is really just the end result of a lot of things coming together, to the extent that the tradition that results from it is almost inevitable. It's like the natural consequence of all of these conditions coming together at just the right time. And so I've been doing this for 7 seasons now, and in the course of doing it, there's a couple themes that just come up again and again and again as I keep going through all these different traditions. The first one is that Christmas is constantly evolving. And the Christmas that we celebrate today is kind of it's a collection of traditions from all over the world and at different points in history. And when I say a collection, I mean a kind of a curated collection. It is by no means the complete collection of every Christmas tradition that ever was. And I'm talking not even close. We're talking just a really, really small sliver of all that Christmas has ever been is reflected in the Christmas that you celebrate every year. In America, we often adopt only some of the traditions, or once we do adopt it, we change it in our own way. And Santa Claus is a really good example of that. I'm going to talk in detail about Santa Claus later on. Another thing about Christmas as something that evolves, and the historian Stephen Nissenbaum talks about this in his wonderful book, The Battle for Christmas. We talked about how Christmas is this major cultural influence and cultural event. And one of the things that influences Christmas is us. People always say Christmas has become too commercial, and my response to that is always, well, I'd be surprised if it hadn't become more commercial. We've become more commercial. Like I said, we've become a very industrial society since the mid-19th century, and that's reflected in almost every part of our life. So of course, Christmas is going to become a more commercial celebration. But the interesting thing is that because Christmas is such a major cultural phenomenon, it becomes one of the things that influences us in return. So it's part of the thing that's making us more of a material and commercial society is because of this massive thing that we do at the end of every year called Christmas that really ingrains in us this idea of shopping and giving and consuming. So it is both a cause and an effect. I'm going to come back to this idea later on. The second major theme that comes up again and again is kind of an extension of this first one, which is that I'm going to keep going this one for a sec. I talked about how there are some traditions that we no longer celebrate, and for that we can be kind of grateful. There are a lot of great traditions from either Christmas past that I think we could bring back. We used to tell ghost stories by the fire on Christmas Eve. That's largely gone away. But then there are other things like superstitious rituals. It was once believed that if a child was born near Christmas, they were likelier to be a werewolf or a vampire, and that you would need to singe their toenails on the fire, because if you didn't, those toenails would likely turn into claws. Christmas used to have all kinds of demons and threats of child abuse and really gross food. I mean, mince pie contains mincemeat, which today is basically just fruit, but it got its name for a reason. It actually used to be minced meat. And just other things that used to be part of Christmas that no longer are. There was a game called Snapdragon where you would take brandy, light it on fire and put raisins in it, and then pluck the raisins out of the brandy. And this was a game that people would do around the fire on Christmas Eve. If you do it right, it's relatively safe. It's just a really bad idea because so much can go wrong with it. So the other theme that comes up is an extension of this Christmas constantly being evolving. If that's the case, well, then the Christmas that you celebrate, and again, I use that phrase really specifically, not Christmas, the Christmas that you celebrate, the version of it that we're familiar with in this generation and the past few generations, is way newer than you might realize. And so I would imagine people from 4 generations ago, 5 generations ago, would take a look at Christmas in 2022 and they'd recognize some of it, that there'd be certain songs that they'd recognize, and a big dinner and some of the greenery in the home, the things that would be familiar to them. But other than that, they would barely recognize it. And we're going to go into some of the reasons why. Some of it's really obvious, right? They would hear White Christmas and they wouldn't know what that was. But there are other things too that are part of Christmas today that are really, really fairly new. The Christmas that we celebrate today is largely something that we invented, and by we, I mean America, in the mid to late 19th century. And when I say invented, it wasn't like we just did it and then poof. It was mostly up in the Northeast. A lot of these changes were happening very quickly. And for a lot of the reasons I already talked about, increasing industrialization, print media, all of this was combined with a massive wave of immigration to the Northeast, where especially in New York, you have all of these immigrant cultures mingling in a fairly small space. And within a few decades, Christmas as we know it really started to take shape. But if Christmas is constantly evolving, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, every Christmas we write the next chapter in this never-ending story. And so if Christmas now would look very, very strange to people from, say, 4 or 5 generations ago, we also have to think that Christmas in 5 generations, people would look back on this and say, oh, wasn't it weird that people used to do, like, wear ugly Christmas sweaters? Or even now, one generation removed from aluminum Christmas trees. I mean, I didn't grow up with them. They were before I was born. I look back at that and say, oh, wasn't that a strange little footnote in Christmas history? We used to have pink or silver aluminum Christmas trees. Isn't that interesting and odd? I mentioned this before, that the Christmas that we celebrate is very, very influenced, or had been very influenced, by Victorian England. I'll talk a bit more about why that was true. But really, starting in the mid-19th century, America took over. And to this day, we remain the largest cultural influence on Christmas. Will that ever change? Probably. I mean, as all things do. But it's been true that for about the last century and a half, America has really been the one in the driver's seat shaping what Christmas is and how we experience it. So let's talk about some of the obvious things. We say Christmas is a lot newer than you realize. Well, okay. Again, most of your experience of Christmas, I mean, just think about, when you think of what you're going to be doing this Christmas season, what kind of things you're going to see, what kind of things you're going to hear. The part of the season that gets, what I like to call aerosolized, the stuff that's just, it's in the air, you're out on a walk and you see it, you're at the store and you hear it, you're just looking through your social media feed. What are the things that the world is telling you Christmas is all about? And, movies are a huge one. And most of the classic Christmas movies that we like are no older than the 1940s. A little interesting side note is that when those movies like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street came out, there was no such thing as a Christmas movie, which is going to sound very strange to a lot of you. I'm sure you're saying, well, what do you mean there's no such thing as a Christmas movie? Miracle on 34th Street is a Christmas movie. Not true. Believe it or not, when those movies came out, they came out in the summer because that's when people went to the movies. It was common back in those days that you would see a movie that featured Christmas outside of the Christmas season. And you have to think about the way that you experience Christmas movies today. Christmas movies are a tradition, something that you'd watch over and over again, something you'd watch with your whole family. And that wasn't possible until the 1950s, until television came out. And then you could have an annual tradition of watching movies with your family. And really, that's only when it started. It wasn't until we get to about the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, when the VCR and cable television came out. And then soon after that, we have the 24-hour movie marathons, that Christmas movies per se become like an actual thing that you can create a tradition around. It's not as though movie theaters would run It's a Wonderful Life every year during the Christmas season and keep it in theaters for about a month so that families could return to the movie theater and watch them as a family and carry on that tradition. Christmas movies as a tradition are a very, very new thing. And just another side note, I always grew up thinking that It's a Wonderful Life, it became a classic Christmas movie because everyone agrees it's just such a great movie. And it's just, it's a classic. And after all, the Library of Congress recognized it as having significant cultural import. The truth of the matter is, what happened was that in the 1970s, it temporarily lapsed into the public domain just because of a quirk of American copyright law. And all of a sudden, a bunch of local TV stations found themselves with a free movie that they could just put on and attract eyes and advertising dollars. It was after that that it became the stuff of 24-hour movie marathons. It's back under copyright protection now, but the genie's already out of the bottle. But had that not happened, the odds are good that anyone who grew up after the 1940s would never have heard of It's a Wonderful Life. It would have just gone into the dustbin along with a lot of other quote-unquote Christmas movies that came out around that time. We can move forward a little bit, and you think Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, that Christmas special is mostly from that came out in the 1960s. It's based on a story that's from the 40s, or the 30s rather, I'm sorry. The Charlie Brown Christmas special from the 1960s. And all of the classic Christmas music, the stuff that we call the American classics, was part of this super, super productive 15-year span that started in the late 1930s. Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow is from the very, very late 1930s. Although you've probably never heard the original recorded version, you can find it. And when you do, you'll understand why you don't hear it on the radio all that often. It has kind of that really old-timey sound to it. So more modern renditions are the ones you're likely more familiar with. And then during the 1940s, and especially during the World War II period, that's when we get basically every classic Christmas song that you know. White Christmas, It's Beginning to Look a Lot Like Christmas, Silver Bells, all of those all came from this period of the 1940s. It extends into the early 1950s, Blue Christmas, a couple of those, and then things taper off. And I just put out an episode about this. It's one of my most recent 2 or 3 episodes about classic American Christmas music, if you're interested to hear. Because I really wanted to understand, well, why is it that, sure, let's take it for granted that the 40s put out a lot of great Christmas music, but what happened after that? Why is it that we got a couple good ones in the 50s, a good, to be fair, a handful of good Christmas songs from the 60s, the Phil Spector album and all of that. But then with every passing decade, it really tapers off to the point where a lot of people would say that 1994 is the last time we had an honest to God Christmas classic song with All I Want for Christmas Is You. There really hasn't been anything else like it, except maybe Kelly Clarkson's Underneath the Tree, which came out within the last decade. But, it seems like most of our Christmas music came out almost a lifetime ago, 2 lifetimes ago, stuff, like when my mom was growing up. So that's the stuff that should feel obvious to people, like that's part about Christmas is obviously quite new. But then think about electric lights, for example. A widespread electrification of homes, it really started around 1880, the early 1880s, and it wasn't instant, right? That's like when things started. And then the first string of electric Christmas lights was introduced in 1882, which that's interesting in its own, because that means that electric Christmas lights were within the first couple of years of electric lighting, the first practical application of home electricity. Now, the truth is, when they first came out, they were really expensive, and most people wouldn't have them for another couple of decades until they could produce them at scale and the price came down. But, lights on Christmas trees, you have to imagine that they can't be older than electricity itself. But still, it's one of those things that is part of the modern Christmas season. We couldn't have Christmas without it. And, 1880, I don't know, for someone my age, that's what, my great-great-grandparents, it's not exactly ancient history. I want to take a look at 2 specific traditions that are surprisingly new. I want to dig in on a couple of them. The first is Santa Claus. Now, this is an interesting one because as a tradition, it goes through many, many phases. Everybody knows that Santa Claus is based on St. Nicholas, who was a real guy. He lived in the 300s. He's a saint in the Catholic Church. We don't know a heck of a lot about him, but we do know some. We know where he lived. He lived in the place that's now Turkey. We do know that he lived a religious life. He was a bishop. And we do know that apparently he was born to wealthy parents who died in the plague, where he had a lot of money and liked to give it away. He also probably attended the Council of Nicaea. That's when Constantine called a conference of bishops to kind of debate and hammer out different theological points. And there is some record. One of the points that they were trying to hammer out was that of the Trinity. Do we adopt this idea or not? Nicholas was against adopting the idea of a Trinity. And one of his colleagues at the conference was a man named Arius, who was pro-Trinity. And apparently they got into a big fight about this on the floor of the council that broke out into a fist fight. And Nicholas was actually jailed for the night because he instigated a fist fight. And then after he died, he became a patron saint, like a lot of other people like him. And he became the patron saint, and all these stories kind of popped up about him during his lifetime. And these are the kinds of stories that you don't really associate with saints anymore. When you hear stories like this, you think, oh, I thought that was only from one figure from the Bible, like he resurrected the dead, for example. More than once. There's a famous story about how these 3 travelers went to an inn. The innkeeper basically stole the travelers' money, murdered them. Then sometime thereafter, Nicholas showed up, learned what was going on, and brought the 3 travelers back to life, and the innkeeper repented, etc. He also multiplied stockpiles of grain. Sound familiar? That's the kind of thing, again, if you grow up in modern days, you think, oh, I thought there was only one figure from the Bible that would do something like that. But, a lot of these patron saints have stories like that of, rescuing condemned people and multiplying stockpiles of food and resurrections and things like that. So he became a very popular saint. He became the patron saint of seafarers and brewers and pawnbrokers. And even to this day, a lot of ships will have a small statue of St. Nicholas as kind of a good luck charm for protection. But we're talking about Saint Nicholas, not Santa Claus. And for a lot of his, I guess, afterlife, right, his life as this patron saint figure, Saint Nicholas had no special connection to Christmas. You would honor him during the winter because Saint Nicholas Day, which honors his birth, is on December 6th. So St. Nicholas Day celebrations were kind of close to Christmas celebrations. But what happened was the Protestant Reformation came along. And the Protestants said, okay, well, one of the things we protest is this devotion to saints. All this stuff just kind of feels a little bit too much like idolatry for us, so we're doing away with it. And it worked to a certain extent, except for when it came to St. Nicholas. A lot of people said, no, we love this guy, right? We love our St. Nicholas celebration. We love St. Nicholas himself. We're really reluctant to give up our St. Nicholas stuff. So a few places said, well, here's what we can do. We can take the St. Nicholas celebration, kind of move it down the calendar a little bit. There's already this other celebration called Christmas. And at the time, Christmas wasn't a big thing, right? It was just another observance. Back in older times, you wouldn't really celebrate the birth necessarily of Jesus. You'd more celebrate the date of his baptism or of his death, right? If that's a big part of the religion, is that he died and resurrected. I mean, Easter would have been the main celebration, not Christmas. Christmas becoming a major cultural and gift-giving and religious observance kind of happens over time, and it really doesn't happen until much, much later. Anyway, St. Nicholas would start becoming connected with the Christkindl, the Christ child. That's the German word for the Christ child. Sometimes they'd appear together on Christmas Eve or around the Christmas season. And if you say Christkindl over and over again while you're thinking about St. Nicholas, it starts eventually to sound like you're saying Kris Kringle, which is exactly where that comes from. It's just a mutation of the word Christkindl to mean the Christ child. It has nothing to do with St. Nicholas, but it kind of does, just because the wires get crossed there. Should I skip ahead here? Yeah, okay. So if you look over to the top left here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, this is an old depiction of St. Nicholas, where he looks very much like a bishop. He's dressed in bishop's robes. This is obviously a modern image. You can tell because it's a color print. But even this is the result of a bit of evolution, because a lot of earlier depictions of St. Nicholas, he wouldn't have a long white beard. He would have a short, dark beard. He died when he was in his 70s, but a lot of the depictions and early paintings you see of him show him as a younger man with a short black beard. So why does he have a long white beard? Well, again, as Christianity is spreading through Europe, he's picking up a lot of other cultural influences. People are converting. It's not a clean process. They're taking a lot of their old legends along with them. Those things kind of get rolled into people's understanding of this new thing that they're adopting. And so there was a lot of cultures had a tradition of Odin, right? The Norse god who had a long white beard. He traveled across the night sky on a magical horse. Sometimes he was pulled in a sleigh. All this should sound very familiar. Children would leave out things like hay and carrots for Odin's horse in their shoes. Again, things that should sound very, very familiar. And you start to understand how they worked their way into Christmas. Then something really interesting happens. We get to the 19th century. And to back up a little bit, there are other traditions, folk traditions from the different European cultures that gradually adopted Christianity that also get rolled into Christmas for a time, and then they get weeded out. And part of those are these kind of like elfin or gnome-like or witch-like creatures that you hear in old European folk tales, the ones that, they would meet kids in the woods, and if they were good, they would get a reward, and if they were bad, they would get kind of a punishment. We start to see St. Nicholas / Santa Claus taking on some of those qualities. This is where we get if you're good, you get a present. If you're bad, you get a lump of coal. Although it's also true that eventually people thought, well, I mean, if this guy's a saint, I don't think he'd go punishing people. So he would get this helper who would go around with him. So you start seeing characters like Belsnickel or Black Peter, as Wart Pete from other different cultures. Those things never really made it over to America. You still see them in like small regional celebrations that have a big like Swedish or Dutch population, Austrian population. I think in Philadelphia, there's a big Krampus celebration, that kind of horned goat demon figure who would go around with St. Nicholas in some places, but we've gradually weeded that out. However, one thing that actually did stick was in the early and mid 19th century, we started doing a little bit of extra work on this character of St. Nicholas, where some key figures in America started putting their influence on this character. One of them being Thomas Nast. He was an illustrator who put out illustrations for Harper's Weekly magazine starting in around the 1860s. Here's one of them to the bottom left. And you can see in this, I mean, we assume this is an average sized woman. He appears to be shorter than the woman, meaning, we can assume that this St. Nicholas is like 4.5, 5 feet tall, something like that. So again, there's some of that like leprechaun, gnome, elfin kind of quality to St. Nicholas. 1820, Clement Clarke Moore writes A Visit from St. Nicholas, which was hugely influential for our understanding of this character of St. Nicholas. Like, how does he operate? What does he do? Things like that. When does he come on Christmas Eve? Believe it or not, that was, and someone had to decide that. Washington Irving had published a history of New York back in the early 1800s, in which he depicts Santa Claus as coming across the night sky in a sleigh pulled by a single horse, and he comes on New Year's Eve, not Christmas Eve. The whole idea that he comes on Christmas Eve, that he comes in a sleigh pulled by 8 reindeer, that he comes down your chimney, all of that is really solidified through A Visit from St. Nicholas. But the other thing, you've probably heard the poem over and over again and never really stopped to think about it. Wait a second, he rides a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer. He has a little round belly. He's a right jolly old elf. Yeah, in Moore's original version of the poem, he's an elf. And it was published originally in a newspaper without illustrations, but Houghton Mifflin put out a color edition a couple decades later. That's what we're looking at right here in the top center left. And you can see he can barely even reach the mantle. And I think in other illustrations from this edition, he has pointy ears, he has a bulbous nose, he has a kind of very gnome-like looking beard. So we're getting there, right? We're moving from this historical bishop, a real guy named St. Nicholas, to this kind of character based on St. Nicholas, who's becoming more and more like what we know as Santa Claus. Here's another Nast Santa Claus. This one is a lot more like we would consider the classic Nast Santa Claus, but still a little bit kind of in the Father Christmas realm. Father Christmas, believe it or not, I thought for the longest time that Father Christmas is just what they called Santa Claus in England. They're 2 separate characters. They're more or less the same nowadays, but they have different origin stories. But this Nast Santa Claus is borrowing a lot from St. Nicholas, with the holly and ivy and the hat, things like that. Even the pipe, that's the Dutch influence. Looks like the Dutch peddler. We see that in Clement Clarke Moore's Visit from St. Nicholas. We get into this modern Santa Claus. Again, notice how St. Nicholas over here is wearing red, and then even in some early color versions, he's wearing brown. In other ones, you see him wearing blue or green. We start to see the red as something that, we more or less all agree, okay, yeah, Santa Claus wears a red suit, starting in about the early 1920s. One of the unsung heroes in the evolution of Santa Claus is this illustrator here named J.C. Leondecker, who is a graphic artist who did covers for the Saturday Evening Post, and his kind of creative rival down here, Norman Rockwell. So throughout the early 1920s, they were doing a lot of these Santa Claus covers for the Saturday Evening Post, which again really start to solidify a lot of ideas that we have about Santa Claus. He's not a gnome. He doesn't have pointy ears. He's just a guy. He's like this 6-foot guy, heavy set, which I think, we tend to see most, in most modern-ish versions. He wears red. He has a long white beard. And so all that was left to do now is put the finishing touches on it. And that really started happening in the next decade, in the early 1930s, with an artist named Haddon Sundblom. We're looking at one of his works in the top right. If you've ever had Quaker Oats and seen the Quaker Oats guy, you're familiar with his work. He's the artist who did that. He did some work for Aunt Jemima. He was just a graphic artist who did work for brands, including Coca-Cola. And so Coca-Cola started hiring him in the 1930s, and he would produce at least one of these Coca-Cola Santa Clauses every year for decades. And again, we go back to the influence of the media. This would be kind of an example of that. We have Coca-Cola's marketing budget where they had, billboards, in-store displays, print advertisements, and all of that, where they could really take their notion of Santa Claus and just blast it across the country over and over again. They had basically unlimited resources to do that. So they were hugely influential in not only crafting a version of a Santa Claus image, but then also just spreading it so far and wide that it essentially became the version that we all agree on. You hear little internet rumors like Coca-Cola actually invented Santa Claus, and like most rumors, there's a little bit of truth to it. There's something to it, but I think it's more accurate to say that we've evolved and iterated on a version of the Santa Claus character since about the mid-19th century, but then we stopped iterating in the early 1930s. You can find different versions of the Santa Claus nowadays. I think we've taken the pipe away, right? We don't really see him smoking that much anymore. You might see him with glasses or without, but for the most part, we all agree on what Santa Claus looks like. He's pretty much fully baked, and that was really in the 1930s. So back to my question, are you older than Santa Claus? Well, let's think about it for a second. The version of Santa Claus that we all know is about 90 years old. There are people alive today who literally are older than this image. My grandfather didn't grow up with it. He was born in the early 1920s, so he might have grown up with these, but again, that really hadn't taken hold across the entire culture in the same way that it did starting in the early 1930s. So again, even something like Santa Claus, which, on the one hand really does trace back to the 300s, but then we can say that Santa Claus proper really got its start in about the mid-19th century and is mostly an American invention. But really, the version of it that you and I recognize is, about 90 years old, surprisingly new. Here's another one, and this will be the last one we look at before I take a little look ahead. I realize we might be running out of time, so feel free to jump in and stop me if I need to, by the way. Thanks. Another internet rumor you like to hear is, Christmas trees, I'll have you know, are actually a pagan tradition. Let me dispel that. No, they're not. They're a Christmas tradition. That's why they're called Christmas trees. I think the better question is, does something about the Christmas tree have pre-Christian roots? And the answer to that is yes. Like I said, a lot of traditions kind of got rolled into Christianity as Christianity spread across Europe. And so there would be these pre-Christian traditions of venerating a tree, worshiping a tree, associating a tree with a god. A lot of Germanic tribes would have a large oak tree that they all kind of rallied around called the thunder oak that was associated with the god Thor. Some of those cultures would also do human sacrifices at the thunder oak. And the legend has it, and it's just a legend, surely, that St. Boniface was going through the Germanic tribes, converting people to Christianity, and came across one of these sacrifices in progress, chopped down the thunder oak and said, okay, you guys are converting to Christianity right now. Oh, and look, behind that oak is this other tree. It's a fir tree. Fir trees are conically shaped, so it kind of looks like they're pointing at the sky. So you can use that as your new symbol, the tree of the Christ child. And that's how the fir tree became associated, as legend goes, with Christianity, but not necessarily Christmas. It wouldn't be until the start of the Reformation when Martin Luther actually wanted a neutral, non-religious symbol for Christmas. Again, remember, they were trying to get out any idly, anything that smacked of that kind of pageantry or idolatry. But for Christmas, they did want to have a symbol. And so he's like, oh, well, that fir tree is kicking around, right? That's a pretty good idea. Why don't we do that? Legend has it that he was looking up at the night sky and saw all the stars and said, and what we can also do is put candles on the tree to represent the night sky. Anyway, long story short, we know that around the 1200s is when we start to see the first Christmas trees. The first one, interestingly enough, was in Strasbourg Cathedral on the altar, which is unusual because you typically would not see a Christmas tree in a church. Again, it was supposed to be kind of a neutral symbol. You tend to see it more like in the town square as a community symbol, not necessarily a religious one. And then there are multiple iterations of the Christmas tree as we move from all those years ago all the way up till now. There are early prototypes from something, these medieval plays called the Paradise Plays. It was a play that told the nativity story on which there would be a tree that had apples on it to represent the tree in the Garden of Eden. Scholars like to argue, well, was that kind of an early iteration of the Christmas tree? Maybe, maybe not. If anything, it's at least just part of the lineage of the Christmas tree. And then later on, you would have something called rag trees, where people would write little prayers on a rag and tie them to the branches of the tree. And so both of those kind of feed into this notion that it becomes common over the years to decorate a tree around a festive time. And certainly, cultures that predate Christianity would bring greenery into their home at Christmas time, or rather during the winter. The conifer trees and plants like holly and ivy and mistletoe were always assumed to have something extra special about them because everything else died during the winter season except for them. And so stories and beliefs would pop up about, well, maybe these things have medicinal properties, maybe they can ward off evil, and if nothing else, they just look nice. So we'll bring those into our home during the winter time. And even today, some cultures still observe the practice of taking all of the greenery out of your house and burning it on January 6th, the Epiphany, as the day where you get all of that out, and it's supposed to either, bring good luck or ward off evil or something like that. So no, Christmas trees aren't a pagan tradition, but tree veneration is a pre-Christian tradition, which got rolled into Christianity, and then kind of like we weeded out everything but the veneration, and then it eventually became a Christmas tradition. So again, like most rumors, there's a little tiny bit of truth to it, but it's not really accurate to say that. So Christmas trees, again, like they became a thing-ish, starting in the 12th century. But now think about it. When did they become common to have in your house? Probably not, probably a lot later than you might have imagined. Now, the way that they came on our radar is that they would get brought into the British royal family through German people marrying into the royal family. Prior to that, this is strictly a local German tradition. You would not see it outside of that area. But Queen Charlotte married George III, brought the Tannenbaum tradition to the British royal family. It didn't catch on because the British royal family was not very popular. However, the next British royal family, the one with Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, who was also German and who also brought the Tannenbaum into the British royal family, was very popular. And her reign was during a time where all of those other major changes that I talked about before were happening. The economy was changing, the media was flourishing, advances in transportation, and all of those kinds of things that made it really easy for, if someone is a very fashionable and influential person, to wield that influence far and wide. And so in 1849, this is the picture we're looking at here, an image was put out in Godey's Women's Magazine, and the image was reprinted in an American magazine. We're looking at the American version here, and you can tell that that's true because Victoria is not wearing her crown. In the British version, she's wearing a crown, and Albert is wearing some kind of sash, but we don't see that here. But anyway, long story short, the following year, the Christmas tree became the must-have accessory in every proper Victorian home. On this side of the pond, Franklin Pierce was our American president. He was the first one to have a Christmas tree in the White House. And after that, things were really starting to catch on. But you have to imagine that Christmas trees couldn't become common, the kind of thing that every household has one in their living room, until they were grown as a commercial crop. You have to have Christmas tree farms producing these things at scale where the average home can go buy one. So for a long, long time, if you saw a Christmas tree, it was because you saw it in the town square. And especially if you lived in like the city, in New York City, you go to a public Christmas tree display. You wouldn't have one in your house. That didn't really start to happen until after the Civil War, and it didn't become especially common until the early 20th century. And so this is, again, the Christmas tree goes back, hundreds and hundreds of years. But really, the Christmas tree as this thing that we all do at Christmas is like 4 generations old at most. And so for someone my age, that's, my great-great-grandparents. I mean, those are people, like, I know those people's names. I have pictures of those people. It's not exactly ancient history, even though the idea of a tree in your living room seems like it must be an ancient tradition, but not quite the way you think. Okay, I'm going to end this with just a couple of speculations. We talked about how Christmas is always changing, and a lot of what you experience about Christmas now is newer than you think. And we think of Christmas history as stuff that happened already. But the truth is, we're writing history too. Every Christmas, I said this before, we write the next chapter in this never-ending story of Christmas, this fluid thing that it has its roots in this religious story from 2,000 years ago, and it's filled with all kinds of things that we already talked about, like the Christmas tree, that seem like they must be ancient, but they're not. And it's really, really new and always evolving. So what are the things that we're changing now? Well, I think I began the talk about how, we see a lot of ourselves reflected in Christmas. A lot of the things that are just true about us in general are also true of our celebration of Christmas. So as we basically did all of our shopping online, of course, we now do most of our Christmas shopping online. And that might sound like well, sure. I mean, of course, that's really, really obvious. But think of the change that has made on Christmas. Before, you'd have to make a lot of time for Christmas shopping. Christmas shopping could be a social thing that you would do with, friends or family. You might go see some lights on the way home. You might have like moments of serendipity where you go to the store for one thing, but then you catch, something catches your eye on a display. We don't really have the same equivalent of that when we're shopping online. It has changed the culture of Christmas. It changes how much time we have during the Christmas season. And now we have, lots of options for what we do with that time. Maybe that's why we put out 170 new Christmas movies every single year. We have this glut of Hallmark Channel movies. I don't know, we have a lot more time to spend. I think the pandemic was a tipping point for telepresence. Skype and Zoom and tools like it are a couple decades old, but I think there was always a bit of a stigma around, well, I mean, would I Zoom with my family on Christmas? That seems weird, until we had no choice but to do it. And now it seems pretty normal. I mean, I'll be Zooming with lots of people on Christmas and it doesn't just feel strange. The Pew Research Center put out a study in 2017, I want to say, where they looked at a lot of things. They asked people questions about how they used to spend Christmas decades ago and how they spend it now. A lot of changes won't surprise you. Fewer people go caroling, for example. We give less to charity. Fewer people go to church on Christmas than decades ago. But there was a double-digit decrease in the number of people who put up a Christmas tree, which shocked me. I mean, I don't know what's going on there. There wasn't a lot of speculating on why that's happening, but the truth is that it is. I think another big thing, two more things that we're doing now is, number one, changes in culture. So here's an example. A study came out last year that found that 37% of Americans subscribe to the belief that there's some kind of war on Christmas, quote unquote. No, I'm not going to judge that or editorialize. I won't even tell you what my own opinion on it is. I'm just someone who observes the trends and tells stories about them. That's something I wouldn't have expected. That, it's really something that we can trace back to about the 9/11 era, where that started to be something that you would see on the news. You'd hear pundits talking about it on TV. Christmas is under attack. And the more I've looked into this, I mean, 5 years ago, if you asked me, is there a war on Christmas? I would have given you a very flat, one answer. And the more you look into it, the more you realize it's not, like most politically divisive issues, it's not as easy as you think. Whatever position you have, whether you believe or don't believe there's a war on Christmas, I would ask you to do a little bit of reading, see if you can surprise yourself, because almost certainly you can. We're starting to see this more and more, where there's the Hallmark Channel puts out all of these nice, cozy, G-rated Christmas movies. But then in the last couple of seasons, they started to push the boat out. They would have more diverse casts. They would have the same-sex couple, either in the focal part of the romance or just supporting characters. And last year, a new network that's run by the person who used to run Hallmark came out, called Great American Family, that's basically saying, if you don't want to see any of that kind of stuff, you can watch our movies and you won't have to, because they're kind of keeping the very sanitized, more or less conservative version of these Christmas movies. I never would have thought 5 years ago that G-rated Christmas romance movies would have been a battlefront in some kind of culture war, but here we are. I think some of the other trends that we're creating now are, and this is I'll finish on this one. I could mention a bunch, but I'll finish on this one, is the length of the Christmas season. And this kind of ties back to something I said earlier in the talk, is we tend to think that the Christmas season begins on Thanksgiving. And I mentioned that that's a pretty contrived and new concept. It really traces back to the early 1920s with the overhaul of our retail experience that you saw from retailers like Woolworths and Macy's and Filene's and Wanamaker's, of department store shopping. Prior to this, most stores, you would have the shopkeeper at the counter who would get goods for you from the back and hand them over to you. This idea of going into the store and picking up stuff off the shelves and bringing them up to the register, pretty new, actually. It's a new model of shopping. And when it was happening in major urban areas where they have these big plate glass displays for the shopping season for Christmas, well, it wasn't long before Macy's in 1923 said, you know what we're going to do on Thanksgiving Day, have a big parade to not only celebrate Thanksgiving, but to kick off the Christmas season. The notion that we all start celebrating Christmas right around Thanksgiving or the day after really was a conscious choice that started in the early 1920s. And when that happened, just like now, we had detractors saying, that's crazy. Like Christmas is not, the Christmas season isn't a month long. Prior to that, it would be something like, the week of, you might put up your tree. A lot of families still to this day put up a Christmas tree on Christmas Eve. That's kind of a holdover from that. So we're constantly rewriting when the Christmas season starts, because you're all familiar with the song, the 12 Days of Christmas. Well, that's because way back when, the period leading up to Christmas was not the Christmas season, it was the Advent season. And if you're religious, it still is the Advent season, but this wasn't the festive time. This was a time for fasting and prayer and restraint. And it was on Christmas Day itself that we had the beginning of the Christmas season that lasted for 12 days until January 6th, and that was the 12 days of Christmas. We've largely done away with that now, and we keep pushing back what we all agree on as the beginning of the Christmas season. So now, we're seeing in October, Hallmark starts its countdown to Christmas. In August, you start seeing store displays. You start seeing those inflatables on the shelves at places like Lowe's and all of that. You're not imagining things. We really are pushing Christmas farther and farther back. And just like it was in the 20s, you're going to have people who are just going to grumble and push and say that's ridiculous or whatever. But my prediction is give that a generation, right? 25 years from now, yeah, I think we're going to more or less agree that the Christmas season starts sometime at the beginning of November, if not earlier. I think we're moving in that direction. I think it's inescapable. And it's just in line with the way that we've always done things. Will it stay that way forever? Probably not. The pendulum will probably swing the other way again, a couple of generations after that. But I think that's something that we're doing now. Every Christmas as a culture, we're extending the Christmas season. I could go on, but I see that I've been talking for a straight hour, so I certainly need a drink of water. I'll pause there and I'll see if there are any questions, and then we can carry on.
Great. So, Brian, hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully I'm coming through okay. So yes, we do have some questions in the Q&A and in the chat. So why don't we get to these? You sort of touched on the first one, but I'll ask it. Is it true that celebrating Christmas was banned by the Puritans as a pagan festival? How did it become a Christian celebration? Was it after the Puritans were no longer in power?
It wasn't if they were no longer in power. The Puritans actually lifted the ban in 1681. And this was in Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's hard to say whether they banned it because they thought it was pagan. There were certain things that they thought were pagan. And there's a rumor that they specifically called out mince pies because they were considered a form of idolatry. And that was true for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of the ingredients in a traditional mince pie are associated with the gifts that the wise men brought to Jesus. And it was common for a long time for people to bake the mince pie in the shape of a manger. They would have special molds for that. They would put crust on top of it and then actually make, like, I'm not kidding, a little baby Jesus crust to put on top of the mince pie. And they specifically referred to them as idolatry in crust. And so during the ban, one of the ways people evaded detection was they started baking mince pies with a different kind of crust. So you couldn't really identify it by sight. And that's why, we've carried that on to this day. The traditional mince pie is the result of that. So that was in 1681. Christmas didn't become a national holiday until 1870. That was something Grant did after the Civil War. But I think there was the second part of the question is, when did it become a Christian holiday? Well, I mean, it's always been a Christian holiday. The thing is, it really wasn't a huge deal. Like I mentioned this before, that, things like Jesus's baptism would have been a bigger deal than his birth, or the date of his resurrection would have been a bigger deal, religiously speaking. Now, I mean, it was marked on the church calendar, of course, and it went through different periods throughout history. Like in the Middle Ages, they celebrated Christmas pretty vigorously. The Puritans banned it in the 17th century. And as I'm talking about this, I'm talking like there was also a puritanical ban on Christmas in England, right? When the monarchy fell to the puritanical government of Oliver Cromwell, it was banned. Same deal, if you were caught celebrating Christmas, you could be fined. Then after the Restoration, Christmas started to come back. But, it had already been gone for a generation or so. So as it came back, we were kind of like rewriting what Christmas is. It took a while for it to become common again. And again, I'm talking on both sides of the Atlantic. And then when it did, we're kind of coming up with different, adding new traditions to it, or bringing back things that maybe didn't necessarily have any special connection to Christmas. And I think the mince pie might have been one example of that, where, it was common to make mince pies throughout the year, depending on where you lived. And then it was more like when Christmas came back, it was like, oh yeah, this is a time for eating rich foods, like that mince pie stuff that we used to be able to eat. And so it came back as, in general, it came back, but then it also sort of took on a special connection to Christmas that it maybe didn't have before. I think I answered that question and then some.
Yes, you did. I can tell you're a podcast host. So an anonymous attendee asks, can you explain the difference between Happy Christmas versus Merry Christmas?
Yeah, so Merry Christmas was for a long time the phrase. That's how you extended the greetings of the season. Again, I said Christmas kind of took a beating for a while, right? It went away, then it came back, and people kind of weren't sure what it was. And prior to this explosion of print media, it wasn't true that all of us had like one idea of what Christmas is and how you celebrate it and when you celebrate it. And so in Victorian England, we start to see a shift. If you read A Christmas Carol, when Scrooge's nephew comes into the counting house, he says, "A Merry Christmas to you, Uncle," right? Like Merry Christmas was a common phrase in England. However, around that time, the way that Christmas was celebrated in many parts of London was a lot more like the way that you and I would celebrate like Mardi Gras or Halloween, meaning it's not something that you celebrate in your house with your family. It's something you celebrate out in the streets and the pubs. It's a public holiday and it gets a little rowdy and raucous. And so the Victorians, starting around the time of Dickens's writing, he was pretty influential on depicting the way that we celebrate Christmas. When Scrooge goes to see Cratchit, they're in the home. Christmas is depicted as this kind of like homey celebration. But again, he still uses the phrase Merry Christmas. But Merry Christmas had sort of become seen as, well, that's what the commoners say. That's like the drunken carousing way to say Happy Christmas to people. It kind of became associated with merrymaking, i.e. drinking. And so subtly a switch started to happen where the upper class started to say Happy Christmas deliberately as a way of kind of making a more highbrow way of extending the greetings of the season. That was solidified with King George in one of his radio addresses where he ends it saying, "To each, to all, a happy Christmas." And then that divide from there pretty much stuck for a few decades. I've always thought that in England, you'll never hear Merry Christmas. It's only Happy Christmas. That's not true. They use it pretty much interchangeably. It's just that right around that time, people were coming over, across the pond to America, and they said Merry Christmas, and Merry Christmas really stuck here. So in England, you can hear both. In America, if you say Happy Christmas, you sound kind of pretentious. You sound like you're trying to sound British. So I think most of us here will stick with Merry Christmas. And again, it's interesting because when else do you use the word merry? Like we keep that word in our vocabulary strictly to bring it out during the Christmas season.
All right, we're going to take 3 more questions. Marilyn asks, or she observes, that Christmas card exchanges is not as popular as it once was. Do you think they may eventually cease altogether? What are your thoughts?
Nope. They have gone down for sure. But I did some research on Christmas cards back in 2016 and looked at several sources of data, including from the US Postal Service. And during the Christmas season, 1.2 billion Christmas cards are sent out. Now think about it, there are 330 million Americans at all, right? Not all of them celebrate Christmas. I mean, we're talking within each Christmas celebrating household, the average person is going to send, many, many Christmas cards. I mean, I think we're sending dozens here at our house. So I don't think they're going to go away. I mean, I think they're just so firmly ingrained in Christmas culture. It's the kind of thing that you thought it should have gone away by now. Like once e-cards came out, once email came out, for all practical purposes, those things should have gone away. There's another way to do that thing that Christmas cards previously did. But Christmas cards are an artifact. Receiving a card in the mail and opening it and hanging it up is a very different experience from opening an email or an e-card. And I also think that it's a business. There's money behind it. I think as long as there's money to be made, there are going to be people promoting Christmas cards. And again, the Postal Service is so firmly ingrained in the culture of Christmas, even though you take it for granted. But if you stop to think about it, during the Christmas season, the mail arriving or checking your mailbox is kind of like part of your day. It's almost like a little mini Christmas because you see who sent you a card and you open it up. Certainly the numbers are going to continue to dwindle. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But go away? No, I don't think there's a chance they're ever going to go away.
So this question came up in a program last week, and it's a semi-serious, somewhat light question. But Diane would like to know, do you consider Die Hard a Christmas movie?
I'm sorry, Diane, I have to punt on this because I've never seen Die Hard and I don't care. And I know this is this big debate. Is it a Christmas movie? I'm like, I don't care. And I take a lot of flack from this from my listeners because I love almost everything about Christmas, except it's not that I don't like Christmas movies. It's just like they're not that important to me. I've seen Elf. I thought it was a perfectly cute movie. I don't need to see it every year. It was a movie that came out 15 years ago. It was lovely, but it's not like this major, I don't need a blow up doll for my front lawn of Will Ferrell. So when it comes to I know I only have to spend a couple hours watching the movie so I can come up with an opinion, but I just don't care.
That's fair. That's fair. So last question goes to Donnie, who wants to know how and where can we listen to your podcast? And I would add, how and where can we purchase your book?
Sure. Well, if you are familiar with how podcasts work, then you can find me wherever you find podcasts. Just, if you listen on iTunes or Google Play or Spotify, wherever podcasts are, you'll find me. Just type Christmas Past into the search bar. That's all I can say about that. For the book, it is available, as they say, at fine booksellers everywhere. You can buy physical copies. I know Barnes & Noble is carrying it, but you probably have a better time getting it online. Probably get a little discount too. And as far as I know, every major online bookseller carries it. So I know not everyone's an Amazon person, but that's probably the easiest place to buy it. But Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, IndieBound, Target, they all have it.
So Brian, I think we're going to leave it there. Do you have any last words for the audience?
Last words are Merry Christmas. Enjoy the rest of the season. It goes by so quickly, but we still have about a week left. So make every day count and have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Want to thank the Friends of the Library and the partnering libraries. Folks, look for an email for me in the next 15 minutes with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and some information about some other upcoming virtual programs. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. And for those who celebrate, Merry Christmas. Thanks, Brian. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Bye.